Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you, as always, by the GSMC Sports Network. My name is Christopher Shepard. Thank you guys for tuning in. Today, we have a great show ahead. For the first time in the history of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, we have some special guests from the podcast network joining me for the first two segments of today's show, so it should be very, very exciting. I'm grateful to have these guys on this show to talk some fantasy sports. But before we get into that, I do want to ask that you like, follow, and subscribe to the show. We get a lot of tips and donations, so if you do feel so inclined, like I said before, we are going to have two very special guests on this show. So without further ado, I'm going to bring them into the show. Let me get my three-person overlay all set. And I just want to introduce to you guys Eric of the Wrestling Podcast, holding it down, been doing incredible things for the wrestling community, for the GSMC Podcast Network. And then I also want to introduce Nelson, our resident basketball expert. We're going to be talking basketball in our first segment, so I'm really excited to have his input and insight for this segment. So before we begin, guys, how are you guys doing? I'll start off, since we're going to do basketball for the first segment, with you, Nelson. How are you doing today, man?
I'm doing great. It's good to be on the show. We're going to talk about basketball, something that I know, something that I really enjoy. And finally, we got our first basketball game in like a week since the conference finals ended. So really excited to talk about that. I'm also excited to talk about that on my actual podcast later at 12:30. If you guys want to tune into that.
All right, and how about you, my man? Easy, we like to call him, holding it down for wrestling, talking some fantasy sports today.
Hell yeah, super excited to be having me on. I dabble in fantasy sports here and there. I watched the game last night, so it should be fun. Should be fun.
All right, so without further ado, let's get right into the first segment. Of course, we are talking about the Celtics-Maveriks Game 1 of the NBA Finals last night. And it was one of those games where you kind of felt like the Celtics had it in hand. There were a couple moments where the Mavs tried to make their little runs, but ultimately the Celtics as a whole collective unit kind of dominated the game. Just going to go over some fantasy points. Luka actually got his, like I said. You're not going to stop Luka Doncic, so that was inevitable. He had 43.5 fantasy points. He had 30 points overall, 10 rebounds, so a great performance from him. But ultimately, where the Mavs fell short is they didn't get production from anyone else. Kyrie Irving only had 19.6 fantasy points last night, so very disappointing performance for him. The Celtics were able to lock him down. And in terms of the Celtics, they were spreading the wealth around, really. And it all started with that man, Tingus Pingus, Kristaps Porzingis, coming back from injury. Great game from him, especially in the first half. He was knocking down threes, blocking shots, finished with 32.2 fantasy points. And then the two big stars, JB and JT, Jaylen Brown is kind of like the heartbeat of that Celtics performance with 42.2 fantasy points. And then Jason Tatum, while he didn't necessarily have big point production, he also finished with 32.7 fantasy points, so not too bad on this day. So I just want to get your guys' thoughts. We'll start off, as always, with you, Nelson. You're the resident basketball expert here. I'm going to leave it up to you if you want to say your little catchphrase for this game, because I don't necessarily think it was necessarily what your catchphrase entails, but I just want to get your thoughts on the game, yeah, and how you're feeling about it.
I don't even say that when I'm live on my podcast. I think it's like, because I felt like it was one of those words where it's like inappropriate or something like that, and you get in trouble. So I don't say that on when I'm actually on the podcast. But yeah, it was felt like they was giving them the business. Like they were like, I understand the game. It wasn't close throughout the entire the whole time, but in the end of the day, I sort of knew that once the Celtics had it, they had it. And the Mavericks, they are a really good closing team, but it's like that scoring that the Celtics broke out with, it was ultimately like what decided the outcome of the game. They won the game basically just right after that first quarter, in my opinion.
Yeah. How about you, Eric? I know you kind of dabble a little bit in basketball. We've talked about it in the past. Kind of want to hear your thoughts on this one as well.
cliche, but they came when they came out of they came back from the half in the third quarter. They did narrow it down to like 8 points, but then after that, it just kind of fell off. And it was kind of crazy, because they were kind of known for their defense. I think they're ranked in number 2 in the NBA. Don't quote me on that, but yeah, they have really good defense. But I don't know, there's just something special about this Boston Celtics team.
Yeah.
And I gotta be honest, I did pick the Mavs in 6, but after watching last night, I was like, oh god, what's going on?
Yeah.
Something might happen.
It is.
Some Boston magic, but these guys are talented players in Tatum and Brown. And you have a lot of role players that are doing that. We needed Kristaps Porzingis to kind of step up and be the guy, and he did.
Yeah, man, it was just an overall team effort. That was what I thought of last night's performance. You had KP coming back from injury, the big question mark surrounding his health. And then you had a guy in Jaylen Brown who just, while not necessarily scoring a lot of points, he definitely helped in terms of both offensively and defensively, as we can see reflected in his fantasy stats. But the big question mark, where was Kyrie in this game? I know that when we talk about Dallas, we always have to talk about both Luka and Kyrie. Obviously, Luka gets more of the headlines, but Kyrie is still a big part of why they're here. He was really dominant. It was kind of like a your turn, my turn kind of thing to get to the finals, where Luka would go off, then Kyrie would go off. So I kind of want your guys' thoughts, starting with you this time, Eric, on how Kyrie needs to find himself and find his way back into the series for the Mavs to stay afloat with the Celtics here.
And honestly, you put it straight out, man. They usually have the back and forth kind of mentality where Luka and Kyrie, and for them to have a successful night, the ultimate unique production from both of these players. And I don't know, I've just seen in the past, and I'm not the biggest basketball guy, but like you said, I've dabbled in here and there. But I don't know, it seems like he steps it up sometimes, and sometimes he doesn't. I remember watching, I think it was the Cavs Warriors 2015, I think it was. I'm not too sure. When LeBron James won the championship in Cleveland. That's when he finally stepped it up. And once when he did, they just seemed unstoppable. They were able to beat down that incredible Warriors team of Klay Thompson, Dre, Mon Green, and Steph Curry. So I think for him to kind of help out the Mavs, he just needs to take it one game at a time, 1 minute at a time, actually. I it's kind of minimize it. He needs to just go out there, trust his shot. I saw problems with his confidence, when he was shooting and stuff like that. Didn't have the same swagger. So, I don't know, he just needs to go in, completely, fully believing in himself. And I feel like he's going to be able to help Luka, because Luka can't, although he's very gifted, he can't do it by himself. He can't. So, Kyrie, you got to step it up, my guy.
Yeah, how about you, Nelson? Was it a rowdy home crowd there? Kind of.
Oh, yeah. He took 19 shots and ended with 12 points, and
that's the story.
Every single three-pointer that he took, he really, you just got to put the ball in the hoop. Kyrie, he's used to making these really tough shots on really competent defenders, and obviously, Drew and Derek White, they are both competent defenders. This feels like, I don't want to say it's, simple, because it's really not, but Kyrie, he makes it look so simple when he plays, and it's you just got to put the ball in the hoop. You're specializing in taking all these difficult shots, and you got to make them. And if they're not falling, then maybe look for better shots, because obviously it's going to be really difficult to hit those shots when you have such competent perimeter defenders on you 24/7.
Yeah, man. And before we go to break, I just want to highlight some of the stats that were kind of worrying for the Mavs. Only 9 assists in the entire game. That's the lowest total for them this postseason. So before we go to the break, what is the game plans for both of these teams in Game 2? If you're the Celtics or the Mavs, obviously if you're the Mavs, you're down a game, and if you're the Celtics, you want to maintain that momentum. So before we go to break, starting off with you this time, Nelson, what do you think the Celtics need to do to maintain this level of dominance, and what do you think the Mavs need to do to kind of get back into the series?
Pray that Kyrie doesn't figure out how to put the ball in the hoop.
And if you're the Mavs, then what we have to do there?
Pray that Kyrie figures out how to put the ball in the hoop.
All right, simple man.
I'm going to keep it simple.
Simple man, yes. All right, Easy, going to you to close this segment out, man. What's your thoughts on this?
Boston just needs to stay aggressive, doing what you're doing. You can let Luka get his to a certain extent. just kind of keen defenders all around. And if you're Dallas, you should probably have Brown shoot more, and just kind of, because in my opinion, because I know Jason Tatum isn't the best 3-point shooter, try to push him out of the perimeter. Don't let him bully ball his way in. But so that would be probably mine. Be like, you know what? Let's kind of ease off Brown and play a little bit. No, ease off Tatum and put a little bit more on Brown, because you said Brown had a bunch of assists, and assists are just, I don't know. I think they're you find the open guy for the best possible point in your basketball shot. So honestly, if you're Dallas, just be patient, key in on Jaylen Brown.
Yeah, man, that's a great point. But that should just about do it for this segment of today's show. Fantastic talking with these guys, as always, getting their input instead of just me rambling on for a couple of segments. So just nice to have different voices on the show. But when we come back, we'll be transitioning from basketball to hockey. I know these guys are not the biggest hockey fans, but I'm going to test their hockey knowledge and talking about the breakout fantasy hockey stars of this season. So we will be right back with this segment right away.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world?
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. Coming up on this segment, we should have a very interesting segment with the boys. But before we begin, I do want to remind you yet again to leave a tip or donation if you do. Here talking about hockey a little bit. I know these two guys are not the biggest hockey guys, but it should be exciting. Obviously, we have a lot of young talent that I kind of want to talk about. Maybe since you're not necessarily hockey guys, I kind of want to get kind of like an analogy as to how you guys view these kind of breakout stars in your respective sports. So just going to start off with a guy I've talked about a lot on the show. If you guys have seen any of my segments, I truly love this guy from the Edmonton Oilers, the young rookie defenseman. Evan Bouchard, incredible fantasy season, one of the leading point scorers for the Oilers in the postseason. So just starting off with you, I guess, Eric, since you're more into like this fantasy mindset, what can you say about a guy who is young and hungry and just wants to do well, not only in real life but in fantasy? And I just want your thoughts on that, because I know you're dabbling in fantasy a little bit here.
Fantasy, you can always count on a young guy. Like when you're, of course, I play fantasy football, so it's a little different. So you get that young quarterback or the young running back, and you know he's just going to produce. He's going to stay healthy. He's going to go out there and he has all the energy and enthusiasm, charisma to get his points, and fantasy points, of course. Which is important for us because we play fantasy, hockey, football, baseball, or whatever you want to do. But hockey's fast. Fast.
Absolutely.
A couple hockey games, and these guys glide on the ice. Like you can be the best athlete in the world, but if you can't skate, oh man! Like ice skating, I tried it once, and it was not pretty. Because we gotta respect these guys.
Yeah.
Honestly, I think you're in good hands when you have a young player like that.
Yeah, how about you, Nelson? I know that basketball is another one of those fast-paced games where you you blink and you miss the action. So how do you feel like hockey translates to like this fast-paced nature of sports?
Well, it is completely different from fantasy basketball, so it's like, and like you say, like I follow hockey, but I don't follow it like that in terms of fantasy. So I can't really say if you can like compare the two, despite the fact that they have fast pacing and like not to mention like the schedule with some of these basketball games, they kind of interfere with a lot of, and it's really sometimes the matches they're down to like what team is scheduled to play and which players are scheduled to play. Because if you have 0 players scheduled to play on one day, you immediately lose that day in fantasy. So it's like it kind of stinks. Like it's not really like, you know how in football where you can everyone is going to play at least some point during the week, and it's most likely going to happen like exactly when you need them to happen. But it's like there are, for basketball, there's some players, like some key players that you aren't going to be able to play. Like let's say you need a win on the very last day before the week concludes, and you have Jokic on your team. But guess what? Jokic is not playing on that last day. You lose, and it's really like it's completely different because you also have to keep in mind like who's injured, who's going to be playing, especially with everyone sitting down. I didn't even mention people sitting down, but the ones that purposely choose to rest some of these games. So it's a little bit more complicated, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I think in terms of like fantasy hockey, you have a lot of different positions to cover, and you just have a lot of different points to kind of think about. Obviously, Evan Bouchard is a young defenseman who is a scoring threat as well. But in terms of fantasy hockey, you also need to worry about, say, you want your centers, your forwards to kind of score you the goals, get you the assists, and then also your defensemen, since fantasy hockey is so versatile in terms of scoring, to kind of get you the hits, the penalty minutes. So it's kind of like a weird thing, and that's why I highlight a guy like Evan Bouchard, because he is kind of in the back line. He's a defenseman. His job is to stop offensive attacks. So it's kind of interesting to see how these different fantasy sports, obviously in fantasy basketball, where points are more at a premium, kind of see how different positions play into it. So I'm going to start off with you, Nelson. What do you think is one of the more valuable positions in terms of fantasy sports, whether it be basketball, hockey, what have you?
Well, I think probably like the center position is
Absolutely.
going to be your most. It all depends. Whichever player can accumulate the most stats at every in every category, that's going to be the best player. So it's like it could be anyone. It could be Jokic. It could be Giannis. Those usually are the top 2 picks in any sort of fantasy draft because they can get a lot of points and they can also get a lot of rebounds on a consistent basis. So players like that can get the scoring done as well as like the rebounding and every other stat. Usually it's rebounding because that's a relatively easy stat to get if you're, especially if you're a center or if you're one of those players that actually hunts for rebounds. It's why Luka Doncic was such a steal and has always been a steal in every single draft. Same with Russ when in 2017 when he was averaging the triple double. That was the king of fantasy at the time in 2017. And so it's like now the king is like Jokic. So it's more so the player than the position, and you usually try to find the players that can accumulate the most stats.
Yeah, absolutely. How about you, Eric? How do you feel about this kind of position-driven mindset in terms of playing fantasy?
In terms of playing fantasy, if I'm not mistaken, I think hockey players, they get subbed out, right? Like super quick.
Yeah.
And sometimes they're on the ice for like maybe 2 minutes tops, and then they go out, and then you don't know when they're gonna come back. So you're kind of sitting there watching the game. You're like, come on, sub back in, you bum. Get back in there, get back in. It's like you. But like in football, definitely the quarterback would be a huge, point stealer and a running back and a targeted wide receiver. But it's hard to predict because a lot of these times when you're doing the drafts or when you're setting your lineup or when you're picking your dudes, you're anticipating some sort of like production from them, and it's just like sometimes they don't. Sometimes they have a tough game. Sometimes they get the yips, as I like to call them. I think that they forget how to do their job, kind of like what Kyrie did on last night's game. But yeah, honestly, it's very important when you pick your, the people that are going to be representing your fantasy league. and especially in hockey. Such a fast-paced environment. I don't know exactly how the scoring goes in hockey, but I can imagine like what Nelson's saying, like how the center, the forwards, they get up to the ice and they try to score. So I can imagine something like that.
Before I let you guys go, I just want to know, who do you think is going to be one of the breakout fantasy players in any sport next year? We have a lot of exciting young players in every sport, so it's gonna be an interesting question. I know it's a tough question, and I'll start off with you, Nelson. Who do you think is going to be a breakout fantasy player in basketball terms? Victor, yes. I know Eric's the Spurs fan here, so that will make him very happy. So, all right, Eric. I know that Victor's a hard one to top, but do you think you can top him there?
Oh man, I'd rather walk off a cliff right now. In terms of the NBA, a breakout fantasy star, I would say probably I'm gonna go with Jason Tatum. I think he's gonna find his way.
Okay.
I think they're gonna he's gonna step it up during the playoffs, because a lot of people said that he's not the guy, that he lets his team down. He only scores like 20 buckets and whatever. But no, I think he's actually gonna step it up. I think I still have the Mavs in 6. Okay. So I can come back on the podcast and you guys can laugh at me when the Boston Celtics win.
Yeah, man.
Honestly, probably Jason Tatum.
Okay, that's a nice pick, obviously, as a Celtics fan. I appreciate that. But that should just about wrap up the segment, and unfortunately that will end these fellas' time on this show. But before you go, do you guys have any goodbyes to say? Want to rep your podcast? I'll give you a couple of minutes to give you a little spiel, if you will. Starting with you, Eric.
Alrighty, guys. Are you ready to go into the world of professional wrestling, sports entertainment?
Oh, yeah.
I take you on a journey every night at 8 p.m. Pacific Time, 11 p.m. Eastern Time for the GSMC Wrestling Lawyer Podcast. We talk about everything professional wrestling, all your favorite stars, and sometimes we do have that entertainment pop culture kind of crossover. So you always know the podcast is going to be very entertaining. I can make you a wrestling fan. Just give 2 minutes of your time, 1,010%. So don't be too shy.
All right, man. That's my man, Easy E right there. Nelson, I know you're a simple man. Any last words from you, my friend?
Just go check out the basketball podcast. The finals are starting, and I stream at 12:30 every single day Eastern Time. So just tune in.
All right, guys. Well, it's been a pleasure to have you. We will see you maybe in a couple of weeks. Who knows? Maybe there will be some different guests. So thank you guys for being on my pod. Really appreciate it, guys.
My pleasure. Thank you, Chris.
No worries. Thank you, man.
Have a good one.
You too, man. So, let me get reoriented here. Coming up next on the GSMC Fantasy Podcast, what a fun experience that was. You're going to have to listen to me for the next couple of minutes, but we should have some very good segments ahead. Coming up next, we will have the rookie mock draft. I will be analyzing a rookie mock draft I did this next couple of episodes, and stick around to the end of the show. I'll be giving you more Euros action, how to play fantasy soccer, and also analyzing my Euros fantasy team. You don't want to miss it. We will be right back on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. Unfortunately, you are going to have to listen to me ramble on after we had a very exciting time with our special guests from the podcast network. But we should have some good segments, like I said, and especially this segment. I'm really excited for this one because we will be analyzing for the first time ever my rookie fantasy football mock draft. Now, a lot of these guys obviously are just promising prospects who are looking to get on an NFL roster. But I really like what I was able to do with this team. We have a nice little mix of guys who I think will have a fantastic rookie year and guys who, while are more going to be seen as more rotational options, I still believe can find their way onto the field, get some minutes. So without further ado, let's get right into it with our QB. Not a bad one to have in J.J. McCarthy. Obviously, we can talk a lot about how J.J. McCarthy is going to have a tough time getting on the field. Obviously, the Minnesota Vikings have Sam Darnold now, so we're going to have to see when J.J. McCarthy is implemented into the squad. But in terms of who he is as a player, I think he really fits into Kevin O'Connell's scheme fantastically. I don't think he's going to have to be asked to do as much as people think, and he will have a receiving core that he can rely upon steadily. And Justin Jettis still has to figure out that whole contract situation, but having a guy like Jay Jettis and an up-and-coming young receiver in Jordan Addison as your two top receivers is not so bad when you're a rookie in the NFL. So we'll have to see when J.J. McCarthy steps into the starting role for Minnesota, but I think he will do very well. I think he's in good hands there. Mike Clay did project him to have a fantastic season. I don't know if he projected him to maybe start mid-season if Sam Darnold did not get off to a good start. But these are fantastic stats from what I see from Mike Clay's projection. He projected him to have over 3,500 yards, not bad for a rookie QB. 19 TDs through the air, 196 rushing yards. As we all know, J.J. McCarthy, one of his assets is his dual threat ability, and 2 TDs on the ground. So as you can see, J.J. McCarthy is one of those athletes who is going to be a high risk. Obviously, if you're in a real fantasy league, dynasty league, PPR league, what have you, J.J. McCarthy, you kind of don't want to really take that risk on. But in a rookie draft, if you want to see how these rookies can play, J.J. McCarthy's an appealing option. Obviously, you have guys out there who will start right away, and Caleb and Jaden and maybe even Bo Nix. But J.J. McCarthy is a project who you guys should be very excited about for Minnesota. I think he will develop nicely as the season progresses should he start some games. But overall, I really like J.J. McCarthy in a rookie mock draft at the QB position. Some other guys I'm really intrigued by. Let's go to the wide receiver position, where I selected with my first wide receiver, Brian Thomas Jr. from Jacksonville. Obviously, Jacksonville is a very interesting situation for a rookie QB. You have a guy in Trevor Lawrence who has had his ups and downs, kind of a roller coaster ride for him in the NFL. And then you lose a guy in Calvin Ridley to your kind of division rival in the Titans. So you really are kind of looking for that next big thing at receiver, and Brian Thomas Jr. could be that. We saw last year in that explosive LSU offense what he could do, what his speed and pace means to this team in terms of vertical routes. He's also a fantastic polished route runner as well, so he should be a go-to target early on for Trevor Lawrence. Look for him to find the connection. Obviously, the Jacksonville Jaguars do have some foundational pieces kind of in that skill position group, but they're not necessarily a big-name wide receiver. You have guys like Travis Etienne at the running back position who can receive out of the backfield, and then a guy in Evan Engram who's slowly becoming one of the best tight ends in the league. So I'm kind of looking for Brian Thomas Jr. to kind of set right into this offense as kind of Trevor Lawrence's go-to target, whether it be on vertical routes, whether it be on crossing routes. I'm really excited to see what Brian Thomas Jr. can do in this offense. And then another guy who I'm really intrigued in the wide receiver position group in this rookie mock draft I did is Jacob Cowing out of San Fran. Obviously, San Fran, you know, they have a multitude of talent at the wide receiver position. They have guys like Deebo Samuel, Brandon Ayuk, fantastic year last year. Jawan Jennings slowly coming on as the year progressed. But Jacob Cowing, as it stands, is behind Brandon Ayuk in the depth chart, only the second stringer. So expect Kyle Shanahan, one of those offensive geniuses, to kind of want to rotate in younger players to the receiving core for Brock Purdy to kind of use as different tools to progress this 49ers offense. The sky is honestly the limit for this 49ers offense, and Jacob Cowing could be an intriguing part of it over these next couple of seasons. Obviously, there has been kind of a little bit of rumor surrounding what will happen to the future of the 49ers receivers, but in terms of going forward, I think Jacob Cowing will slowly be implemented into this offense, become one of Kyle Shanahan's favorite offensive weapons. Now, looking at the running backs, I have a couple of guys who I don't necessarily expect to play a lot because they're in very tough running back rooms to kind of compete in, but I think that they're kind of nice little projects for a rookie fantasy mock draft. Starting off with Audric Estime, another of these Jersey running back products. I have St. Joseph's Regional. Shout out to St. Joe's. Audric Estime was just a fantastic running back overall. Fantastic contact balance. Fantastic yards after contact. Just a bullish kind of running back you kind of want in your system. But like I said, the Broncos running back room is going to be tough to break into. They already have an established star in Javonte Williams. You have guys like Jaleel McLaughlin, Samaje Perine in that running back rotation. So it's going to be hard to come by in terms of minutes for Audric Estime. But I am really intrigued to see if he does get any minutes at all this season. And then there's another guy in Cody Schrader who had a fantastic year at Missouri last year, a breakout star in the SEC, moving to San Fran, where obviously Christian McCaffrey is already established as the go-to guy at the running back position. But Cody Schrader's just a nice little utility project to keep your eye on in the next decade or so. Maybe he can be one of the preeminent kind of backup options for a fantasy squad in the next couple of years. But the position I'm most excited about in terms of this draft is the tight end position, because this is a guy whose ceiling is super high. And I think that is actually his floor is very high. So, obviously, in Jatavion Sanders, you have a guy who's like a freak athlete at the tight end position. He can receive. He can block for you. He can run seam routes seamlessly. He's obviously not the best tight end in this draft, in this rookie class. That would be Brock Bowers. But Jatavion Sanders, going into a Carolina offense, is looking for different levels of production in that skill position group. Obviously, you have a guy in Adam Thielen who's getting up there in age, and a guy in Jonathan Mingo who just got drafted a year ago, and a rookie quarterback in Bryce Young who's kind of in that same situation. So they really want to find a guy who they can really utilize at all levels of the offense. I'm really thrilled to say that Jatavion Sanders could be that guy. I saw him at Texas, obviously, as someone who's a huge Texas fan. He was so integral to how that offense set up. And moving into a Carolina system where Dave Canales comes in, the different mindset going forward. Obviously, you really need Bryce Young to have a standout breakout year for the Carolina Panthers to really reconsider how they view their future. And Jatavion Sanders, look for him to be a huge part of that. Some other guys I have in this team who are not necessarily noteworthy, but I really, really like and love their story a lot. A guy in Jordan Travis going to the New York Jets, who is definitely not going to start. Obviously, Aaron Rodgers is still there, but he is a nice little backup option just because of his incredible story. Obviously, last year with Florida State, he had a breakout year, had a Heisman Trophy level kind of season until he broke his leg in a tragic incident. So I'm just really rooting for Jordan Travis as an NFL player. He may not be a high-level starter that can get you production every day of the week, but he certainly is a feel-good story who I'm definitely going to follow as his NFL career progresses. He could be one of those journeyman backup QBs who is good for a game or two, as we've seen in the past, than guys like Mike White for the Jets, guys like Trevor Siemian, perhaps. So I'm really, really, really intrigued to see how Jordan Travis fits into the Jets' plans for the upcoming years. But that should just about do it for this segment of this show. I was really happy that I got to analyze my rookie mock draft for you guys, because this is just an incredibly exciting class. We should all have fantastic NFL careers. So I'm really looking forward to seeing how the class of 2024 pans out in the NFL. But coming up next, even more exciting segments I'm very excited for, because there is more Euros action, more soccer action. So next segment, I'm going to be telling you guys the guidelines and tricks of the trade to play fantasy soccer. It should be a very intriguing segment, and stick around for the end of the show, where I will be talking about the Euros, specifically my Euros fantasy squad that I'm really excited to show you guys. So please stick around and tune in for that. You don't want to miss it. We will be right back.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC. to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. We have another round of exciting segments based off of soccer and the Euros tournament coming up next for you guys. We are going to start off with, I know you guys know that fantasy soccer is getting more popular worldwide. There are so many different variants of how to play fantasy soccer. You have Fantasy Premier League, obviously from England, Fantasy Champions League. But how do you necessarily play fantasy? And so, in honor of the Euros starting up in a week now, I am going to tell you guys the tricks of the trade and how to play fantasy soccer. A little Euros edition to celebrate these tournaments that are coming up in the soccer world. So, buckle your seatbelts, guys, and heighten your ears. This is going to be a very exciting segment that I don't want you guys to miss out on 1 second of. So, without further ado, let's get right into it. So, for fantasy soccer, how it all works out. As any fantasy sport has, there is a budget. You have 100 million euros to spend on your squad. As the stages progress, as we get into the knockout rounds, you have $105 million to spend on your roster from the round of 16 onward. Now, in terms of your squad, you have a 15-player squad. You have 2 goalies, 5 defenders, 5 midfielders, and 3 forwards, and before every match day, you have to select 11 of those players, as obviously soccer is an 11-player game. However, you do have a limit on players from one team, so you can't have more than 3 or so players from one squad on your fantasy squad. Now, for each patch day, like I said, you have to pick your 11. All points will be scored from your 11. So the 4 players that you leave on your bench will not contribute to your squad's official point tally at the end of the day. Once you set your 11, you cannot change it. Getting into subs a little bit. You can sub any players into your squad except in the final, because obviously there are only 2 squads playing in the final. You can't necessarily rotate out that many players. So, you also can only sub in players who haven't already played on the match day. So, for example, if you have a player who you want to swap out and he's playing an earlier game, say a 12 noon game, and you have a guy in your squad who's playing a 3 o'clock game, you can only make that sub, right? You can't make a sub for a player who is playing at the same time in that match day. In terms of captains are a huge part of any fantasy soccer league because of the fact that, most importantly for them, every time they play, their point tallies are doubled. Once you captain them, their point tallies immediately double. You can't necessarily change your captain as much. It's kind of the same rule as with subs, where you can't play a captain if you already are playing him. Let's say he's playing already and you want to kind of change your captain. Oh, you see a little hidden gem on your bench who you might want a captain. You can't do that. So be careful in who you choose as your captain, because it's vital going forward that you really kind of center your team around who you want your captain to be. As with any fantasy league and in any soccer-specific fantasy league, you have to have transfers. Obviously, you have to have the opportunity to bring in players who you might like for your squad and let some go. But however, there is a caveat. So, before the tournament begins, let's say you are crafting your fantasy squad. Unlimited amount of free transfers before the Euros even starts. So, let's say you're not comfortable with the team you picked, you have a little bit of budget money that you want to spend, and you want to use it on someone who you think can help your team. You can do that with all of your leisure before the Euros. However, getting into the Euros, there is a quota on who you can bring in. So, let's say you're in the group stages and you decide to bring in a player. Obviously, the number of players that you can't bring in goes up, if that makes sense, as the stages progress. So let's say you're still in the group stages and you want a different player to bring into your squad, maybe a player who plays later in the match day. You're going to have to make sure that you hit that quota for the day, because you can't go over. If you go over, you are deducted 4 points from your squad. So make sure that on every match day you pay attention to who's on the transfer market, so the fact that you can hit your quota in terms of free transfers for the day before the match day even begins, because once you're in the match day, you're kind of screwed if you have hit that quota already. So, without further ado, let's get into the most important parts of the fantasy soccer system. The points. Obviously, you have things like goals and assists, and they are very high. Goals for a midfielder are 5 points, so be wary of that. For a forward, they are 6 points. Actually, for a forward, they are 4 points, and then for a defender, obviously, since they are in the back line, 6 points. An assist for any player is 3 points. And last but not least, this is an interesting stat to know if you are looking for a midfielder who can kind of cut and shoot. A goal from outside the box is 1 point. And then for after-match things, Player of the Match award gives you 3 points. However, there is a negative connotation to point systems. You get rewarded in soccer for scoring goals. You get punished for things you do, and obviously that is reflected. So, if one of your players gets a yellow card, that is minus 1 point. If you have a red card, minus 3 points. So be very wary in terms of picking your back line, especially because you don't necessarily want a guy who's known to be a hothead. So be very careful, especially in terms of picking your defenders, because you don't necessarily want your point tally to be affected by something like a yellow card or red card. Now, goalies are a very special position because they obviously have their points tallied differently because they are not playing in the outfield. So, in terms of goalies, saving a penalty is probably the hugest point getter for goalies in fantasy soccer. Saving a penalty earns you 5 points. A clean sheet is also a very high tally. So, that gives you 4 points. But in terms of negative connotations, 2 goals conceded, you are deducted a point, and an own goal from actually any player deducts you 2 points. So, in terms of goalies, they're a very special player. It's one of those positions that you kind of have to pick and choose how you want to set up, because you get the opportunity to pick 2 goalies. So that rotation is going to be very interesting to see, especially if these match days all get muddled together and you really are kind of trying to figure out who to roster on your fantasy squad. So be very kind of wary of how to pick a good goaltender for your fantasy team. But that should just about do it for this segment. I really loved talking to you guys about this different kind of system. Obviously, I know you guys may already know about fantasy soccer, but for those who don't, it is really, really exciting. There are obviously a lot of different leagues that you can go into, not just for the upcoming Euros tournament. You can play Fantasy Premier League. When the Premier League comes back, you can play Fantasy Champions League. Obviously, kind of like the Euros, since it's a knockout tournament. You can play so many different varieties of fantasy soccer. But just to celebrate the hype of the Euros as it comes up in the next week, I just wanted to highlight that because it is very special to my heart and to the many soccer fans who might be viewing this right now. So, thank you guys. Coming up next, another exciting Euros segment where I'll be analyzing my very own Euros fantasy squad, seeing the different players who I really like and some of the players who I'm kind of taking a flyer on in my lineup. It should be a fantastic segment to close out today's show. Please stick around for that segment on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. We will be right back. We'll end with a bang. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the day's final segment of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. We are going to stick in the soccer realm for what should be another exciting segment in terms of the soccer world and in terms of the upcoming Euros tournament. We are going to be analyzing my very own Euros fantasy squad. A lot of different exciting players who I really loved from last tournament, and some players who I'm kind of taking a risk on, who I kind of want to see step up for this edition of the Euros. So without further ado, let me go to my one-person graphic. But as always, do like, follow, and subscribe to the show. That'll just about do it from the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you, as always, by the GSMC Sports Network. My name is Christopher Shepard. I really enjoyed this show. We will be back next week for even more excitement in the fantasy world. Back better than ever. So tune in and see about that next week. Thank you, guys.